Welcome to Christian Parent Crazy World, the podcast that tackles tough topics to help you be a godly parent in an ungodly world. I am your host, Catherine Seegers, and in today's episode, we will tackle these complicated and combustive questions. What shapes our perceptions of manhood, of what it means to be a man? And how does that affect our families and our culture? You guys, this topic is explosive. The cultural landscape around us is embroiled in conflicting views on masculinity. My special guest today has been hailed as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. That is a mouthful. And she is a mindful. Yes, I am speaking of none other than Nancy Pearcey. Her latest book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, is, and I don't say this lightly, a must-read if you are a man, or you have a husband, or a son, or a son-in-law, or a future son-in-law, or a dad, or a brother, or if you come in contact with men like ever in your life. So essentially, if you're not a nun, this book is for you. As you will see in today's conversation, these toxic perspectives on masculinity are rotting away the foundation of our families and our culture. We need to know how we got here and how to heal. That's the plan for this episode of Christian Parent Crazy World. So let's get started. I have gotten to meet some of the most respected and renowned apologists in the world since starting Christian Parent Crazy World 3.5 years ago. But I have never been more excited to bring a guest to this audience than I am today. Nancy Pearcey has been a personal hero of mine for over a decade. Now, earlier this year, I went to the National Religious Broadcasters Conference in Nashville, Tennessee, and I had one thing on my mind. Like, seriously, one thing. Meet Nancy Pearcey and ask her to come on CPCW. And I was able to do just that. And she graciously agreed. I'm going to post a shameless picture of me meeting Nancy on Instagram. I'm all awestruck and ridiculous looking, I'm sure. But what I could only dream of but never really imagine is that Nancy would spend the whole afternoon with me, sharing her heart on what is one of the most critical issues of our day. So I'm going to be spending several episodes with a woman who The Economist hailed as, quote, America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual, end quote. Now, I would completely agree with that, only I drop the female. Seriously, no need to qualify it with female there. All right, so for a little more context, Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, which we're talking about today, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, one of my all-time favorites, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has spoken at Princeton, Stanford, USC, Dartmouth, and now here, she's finally arrived, right? And she has been quoted in New Yorker, Newsweek, all sorts of places, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists. I would drop the woman. Thank you very much. By Christianity Today. All right. So in today's episode, Nancy's going to walk us through the historical origins of toxic masculinity. This is fascinating. She's going to contrast it with positive examples of biblical manhood. She's brilliant. You're going to love this. So get ready to unpack these weighty topics as Nancy Pearcey joins us to shed light on the real roots of masculinity and why this subject is so crucial for families, communities, and our culture today. Nancy, welcome to Christian Parent Crazy World. It's such an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
I fell in love with your work a decade ago with Saving Leonardo in our homeschooling circles. And that was one of the books they recommended we read. And I actually led a group of women in a book club on that book. It's fascinating. And I never imagined in all of my years that here a decade later, I would have the opportunity to sit down and actually speak to you about a work that was yet unpublished at that point. But I'm so grateful. And I'm not going to lie, in my homeschool circles, I've got to interview some really amazing people on the show, but nothing has made me more of a rock star in my circles than telling people that I was going to be interviewing Nancy Pearcey. They were so excited. My friend Erin said hi, by the way. I've got a lot of friends that would like to say hi to you because we're all such huge fans of the work that you are doing for Christians, for families, for moms, for dads, for men, for women. Thank you so much on behalf of all of them. And thank you for making me a rock star in my homeschool circles.
Thank you. That's quite a compliment. I appreciate it.
Well, I honestly believe that you have written one of the most important books of this generation. And I'm not saying that to exaggerate. I really believe that. You've written one of those rare books that I will recommend, not just to every Christian, but to honestly every adult, I believe, needs to read this. I don't say that lightly, but few issues are eating away at our society more than the toxic views on masculinity. It affects everything. The trickle-down effect of our views on masculinity are affecting women. They're affecting fathers. They're affecting mothers. They're affecting children. They're affecting everything. And I recall you saying at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, where I was honored to meet you after one of your incredible sessions on this, that your book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, is the most controversial book that you've ever written. And for some context, your book before this one was Love Thy Body, and it was on abortion, homosexuality, and transgenderism. So how in the world is masculinity the most controversial topic that you've written on and the most controversial topic that we face today?
I have to admit, I was surprised too. I did not expect that. But when I write a book, I always run a lot of reading groups to rub off the rough edges. And when my reading groups would tell their friends and family they were going through a manuscript on masculinity, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on? And men tended to just assume that a woman writing a book on the topic would be a male-bashing feminist. And more progressive types just assumed I was kind of a red pill reactionary culture warrior. And then even after the book was published, the day after it came out, it was jumped on Twitter by a group of Christian feminists who, or egalitarians, I guess is the term that they would use for themselves. They said that it was too nice. It was too nice to theologically conservative men, and that was dangerous and harmful. And then when that finally died down, I sort of got attacked by the neo-patriarchalists who said, well, we like your book, but you didn't come out with a rip-roaring defense of complementarianism.
Yeah, you're right. I noticed that in the book. I'm like, for a long time, I was trying to figure out where do you line up? Because I have some particularly egalitarian views about women in ministry, but I also have some complementarian views there in the home. And for our listeners who may not understand the difference between complementarian and egalitarian, could you enlighten us on that for just a second?
Yeah, well, I do, in fact, explain in my book why I don't deal with it. Complementarian is simply the current word for people who believe that there's male headship in the home. Ephesians 5, right? Husband is the head of the home, the head of the wife. And egalitarians are people who say, no, there's no hierarchy, there's no authority structure in the home and in marriage, and should not be in the church as well. And so the reason I didn't deal with that is, number one, I had two reasons. Number one, the researchers I was looking into did not deal with that topic. And so I was reflecting what the research actually shows. But secondly, one of the things it shows is that complementarian versus egalitarian does not seem to make any difference in how happy a marriage is. And so two of my top researchers, the sociologist Brad Wilcox, he's at the University of Virginia. He is considered perhaps the country's top marriage researcher. And he said, in our research, in our studies, we did not find that egalitarian marriages were any happier. And then the other expert was John Gottman, who's Jewish, by the way. And he is considered the top marriage psychologist in the country. And he does very quantitative research. And he too said, people coming into our practice sometimes think the man should be in charge and sometimes have more egalitarian views. And what we found is that Here's an actual quote. He said, emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the one most important thing, which is how to show honor and respect to your wife.
Yes.
And so my two top researchers both agreed that a man's gender theory does not really have much impact on how happy his marriage is. And I present that information and I tell my readers, and therefore I'm not actually going to even get caught up into that debate. But of course, as soon as the book came out, all these Christians wanted it to get caught up in these little in-house debates. And you'll understand this, Catherine, because, you know, you and I are more apologists. You know, what we're interested in is addressing the secular world.
Yes.
And the secular world's attacks on Christians. And so my goal in the book was not to get caught up in little in-house debates among Christians, but to say, how does the secular world get its view of masculinity so wrong? Where did that come from? And how can we craft a biblical response? And so that's the goal of my book.
Yeah. So to share with us, you had some examples both in the book and in your speech at NRB, or your panel discussion at NRB, on how toxic the ideas about masculinity are in our culture right now. They're mind blowing. I had no idea how bad it had gotten.
Exactly. I was caught by an article in the Washington Post that was titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, when did it become socially acceptable
Really?
to be so hostile in a mainstream publication? The Huffington Post had an editor who tweeted hashtag "kill all men" and then said it was a joke.
Oh.
I don't think it's funny.
No, I don't.
And speaking of jokes, you can buy T-shirts that say "so many men, so little ammunition."
Ugh.
And even books with titles that are very blunt, like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" And then what really broke my heart was seeing some men jump on the bandwagon. A male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then my final example, because it's the most recent, you may have seen it because it was in the news. The director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, was in the news saying testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So no wonder men feel a culture has become very hostile to masculinity. I quote a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal, and she said, the young men coming into my practice are particularly beaten down and depressed and demoralized because that's all they've known,
right,
is a culture that's hostile to masculinity. And I have a couple of surveys. 2020 here in America, something like 46% of men said that they agreed with the statement, these days, society seems to punish men just for acting like men.
Yeah.
And then there was a global one, 24 countries. And, the number was higher. I think my memory is it was like 55% of men around the world said discrimination against men has now become worse than discrimination against women. And whether you agree with that or not, that is a lot of people who think men are getting a bad deal now. And so it is something we need to address.
Absolutely. So the premise of your book is that men are being torn between two competing scripts to define their masculinity. And I love how you quoted Mark Batterson there. I've read a number of his books as well. He's great. But you talk about the software versus the virus, and you also talk about these two competing scripts. So explain to us what those are.
Yeah, so this is a study as well. It came from a sociologist, and I put it at the front of the book because, like I said, I was getting a lot of suspicion and even hostility from people who, if they just heard about the book. Once they got into the book, they said, oh, this is interesting, and they liked it. But, man, I had that initial hostility to overcome. And so I put this at the front of the book. The sociologist gets invited to speak all around the world. He's very famous. And so he came up with a very clever experiment to find out what young men think these days. He asked them two questions. The first one was, what does it mean to be a good man? You're at a funeral, and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? He said all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a protector, be provider, be responsible. And he would say, well, where'd you learn that? And the young man would say, well, I don't know exactly. It's just in the air we breathe. And so as Christians, we would say it's God's image in men. Men are made knowing that their unique masculine strengths are not given them to just get whatever they want, but to provide and protect for those they care for. But then he would follow up with a second question, and he would say, what does it mean to you if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid, using their language. And so sociologists concluded that young men today are, in fact, trapped between these two competing scripts. There's this innate, universal sense of what it means to be the good man. And that's encouraging, by the way. I thought that part of it was very encouraging.
It is.
But then they feel trapped by other cultural expectations, which fit more of the toxic stereotypes. But what it means is that we have a better way to approach these issues. Men don't respond very well to being called toxic.
Really? Imagine that.
What a shock. But can we tap into and affirm and encourage and support that innate knowledge of what it means to be a good man? I think that's the challenge. And it gives us a much more positive way then to approach men on these issues.
And you have some personal authority to speak on this, don't you? I did not know in your introduction, you went into your personal history. You know a little bit about that bad script, the real man, or the man that's toxic in his masculinity with your own upbringing, don't you, with your father?
Yeah, I decided to put that at the front of the book. My father was severely physically abusive. He wouldn't say, do this, I'll spank you. He'd say, do this, or I'll beat you. He was very open about it. And his favorite was the knuckle fist. That's where you have the middle finger slightly extended to cause a sharper stab of pain, because he was, punching us and kicking us. And I did have an interview with a Christian psychologist, and he said, well, at least we know you're not speaking from an ivory tower. You're speaking from the trenches.
You are.
And it's true. It was not easy for me to write a book that would be fair and positive towards masculinity. In the introduction, I say, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life, which is true. So I thought it was helpful for people to realize, I'm not coming from a warm, loving, privileged home where this is easy for me to say. This is very hard won, to fight my way through years and years and years of emotional and psychological and spiritual healing so that I could write a book like this. So, yeah, I hope it connects with people who maybe don't have, like me, who had more of a dysfunctional or difficult childhood, that the book's for you too. Because so many books, when they give the Christian view, sound almost kind of Pollyanna-ish.
Yes. It's so funny. I was with a group of young people at my church in a class the other day, and I was talking about Pollyanna the other day. They had no idea. I think they're millennials. They had no idea who Pollyanna was, and I had to explain that. Just that, yeah, everything's happy-go-lucky and everything's positive about everything. I was, having read your works for some time, to hear that part of your testimony about that part of your life was just very eye-opening and very moving, very moving. I was extremely moved on your behalf of what you lived through as a child, and that you could then come full circle after going through time of being agnostic atheist to being a, pretty radical in the feminist movement, then back around to being able to affirm biblical masculinity is quite a journey. And I absolutely love, chapter 1, you start off with that in your introduction. And then chapter 1, you give the most brilliant example of these two different scripts with this. You share this story of something that happened in 2018 with a divorced Marine. His name is Ian David Long, and he went into was the Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks, California, and he tossed smoke grenades around, and then he drew out a pistol that had a laser sight on it, and he began shooting customers one by one. I think anyone would agree that it would be a very toxic form of masculinity. He ended up killing the sheriff. He killed 12 other people before killing himself. But Also in the crowd, you mentioned there was a young man by the name of Matt Winterstrom, looked like a typical college student. And that's what you said about him. As soon as shots began booming through the air, he and about 7 other young men grabbed as many people as they could, pushed them under a pool table for cover. Then they piled their own bodies over them to protect them from the hail of gunfire. And Winterstrom went on to tell reporters that the reason why he did this, he said, "My life is taken care of. I know where I'm going if I die. So I was not worried to sacrifice." I was like, wow, what a perfect example of the two different scripts we have of a real man versus a good man. Of course, I don't think anybody that would rather be a toxic man. And the good man, it comes innately to many men. It's part of who God created them to be, the imago Dei of who he created them to be in his image. And you go on to say 2 young men, one used his masculine strength to take lives. The other used his masculine strength to save lives. But which of the 2 men at the bar that terrifying night exhibited traditional masculinity? That's the question you set out to answer. And boy, do you in this book. So the origin of toxic masculinity, I know that it began much earlier than we think. So tell us about the origin of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, so many people, including myself, just assumed that it came out of the 1960s, second wave feminism, maybe. But to my surprise, when I started looking at the history, you find the negative language that started to be applied to men back in the 19th century after the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, most men worked with their wives and family all day, right? They were on the family farm or the family industry or the family business. And the father in particular is training his sons in the skills that they will need for their adult life. And fathers were expected to be just as involved with their kids as mothers were. You know, both men and women were able to perform economically productive work while with their kids because that work took place in the home, you know, and it's outbuildings. And so I have to tell you, you know, I went to Europe when I was young, and in the villages, you could still see this pattern. I would go down the street with my little basket and we'd go to the butcher and the whole family is working. It's the front room of a home, including my classmates from school. And then you go to the baker and the whole family's working together, and the greengrocer. So there's pockets in Europe where you can still see the whole family working together like that. And so the question then is, how did we lose that? And the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. Of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, American men were not working alongside people they loved and had a moral bond with, you know, the family members. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And it was a very different emotional environment, as you can imagine. And that's when we see people begin to complain that men were changing, that they were losing the caretaking ethos of the earlier age, that they were becoming egocentric, self-seeking, you know, greedy, acquisitive, aggressive, and making their career into an idol. It was interesting. That was a common phrase back then, is that men were becoming more secular as well at that time and turning their financial success into an idol. And so in the 19th century, you already see language that is just as strong and just as hostile, just as critical as what we see today. So that was a big surprise. And of course, it does also tell you what the solution has to be. If it started when men were separated from their families, you know, how can we, even in the industrial age, can we reconnect men with their families? You know, I have a whole chapter on ways that we might be able to flex the workplace. And the pandemic was a game changer. This is not in the books. It's so recent that it's not even in there. But Harvard University did a study, and the conclusion was this. During the pandemic, 68% of men said that they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. They do want to keep some kind of hybrid arrangement, flexible hours, or whatever, so that they can have more time with their kids. They found out they like being with their kids. And so I think, you know, I quote one psychiatrist who says, we're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers. the long-term solution to toxic behavior in men, such as it is the relationship between the father and the son, raising the next generation.
Absolutely. I told you before the show, and, we've had a couple of instances in our life where we've been able to have my husband at home more. I think we all experienced that with the COVID lockdowns. And as I was reading your book, though, I was reading about how this all shifted with the Industrial Revolution. I found myself really missing what I never had. I never had this. I had these little glimpses of it. So with the COVID lockdown, my husband was at home for that couple of months, and then he kind of went back at an abbreviated pace at work. He's in the hospitality industry, in the hotel industry. And so I found myself really loving having him there, having that presence there, physically, emotionally, spiritually in the home, that male godly presence in my home. It made such a difference. And we actually had a little season this year where he was at home a little bit in between jobs, and we had it again. And when he goes away, I really miss that. I'm like, this is what people used to experience. And of course, I want my dishwasher, and I want my washing machine, and I love all of the things that the Industrial Revolution helped to produce for us. But we need to pause for a moment, don't we? We just need to pause and recognize what we miss from this, because you're right. We do need to find ways to integrate men back into the home when they're gone 8, 10, 12 hours a day, 5, 6 days a week. Integrating them back into the home, into the spiritual life of the home, because when you were speaking earlier, it's not like they're gladiators out there, but in a way they are. They're out in the world fighting all of these other battles, and then they come home and are called to have a very different mindset in a home. It's a hard transition to make for them, isn't it?
It is. And I did have to rely a lot on anecdotes. And I'll give you one. This is the counterpart to your anecdote, is that one of my graduate students, her husband came home. He's an IT professional and came home during the pandemic. And because he was home, he was more involved with the family's homeschooling. Because he was home, he could take the kids to soccer and choir practice. Oh, yes. And he decided he would be the one to make lunch for the family since he was there. And then, of course, I interviewed him, and he said, our family is so much more balanced now. I am never going back to 8 hours in a cubicle. And he picked up so many of the family responsibilities. His wife started a part-time job, and the whole family benefited from the added income. But then the real kicker was this. He said to me, the time I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying with my wife.
Wow.
And I thought, what a story. These are the stories that can inspire us. And by the way, the corporate world has to get on board too. But the pandemic helped with that. I made a point of researching some CEOs of companies. And here's one. This is a direct quote. He said, we were very reticent about remote work before the pandemic, but the pandemic has completely exploded that fear. We did not see any discernible drop in productivity. So we have to bring this material, bring these quotes to your boss and help them to see that. One of my favorite articles, and we actually were talking about it before we started the show, there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly, which sold more copies than any other article in that entire history of the magazine. And it was about how it was written by a woman who said women can't have it all. And by the way, did you notice it was immediately followed by Time magazine saying, well, men can't have it all either.
Yes. That was Anne Marie Slaughter's article. I put that in my ebook as well, her article on women. Yes. Hey, you guys, Nancy has written the quintessential work on masculinity and fatherhood and the toxic war on masculinity, how Christianity reconciles the sexes. But did you know that I have published a powerful free ebook on how our culture marginalizes mothers? Well, I did. It's called Beyond the Lies, Uncovering 5 Myths Our Culture Spreads to Mothers. In this short work that'll take you about 20 minutes to read, I condense years of research on modern secular feminism into these 5 lies that most women believe about motherhood. So get your free copy of Beyond the Lies, Uncovering 5 Myths Our Culture Spreads to Mothers today by subscribing at katherinesegers.com. Now, back to my conversation with Nancy Pearcey.
But here's what she said. Here's the quotable part. She said, if companies give parents time to be better parents, flexible hours when they need it, for example, they make better workers. Better parents make better workers. So it is in the company's benefit as well to be family friendly. We usually think family friendly means for the women, but it means for the husband. It means for the father too. There was this meta survey done. 70% of fathers said that they would rather have flexible hours that gave them more time at home, even if it meant a smaller paycheck.
Wow.
And of course, they don't usually say that at work because they're afraid they're going to get tagged as not being motivated enough.
Right.
But on a survey, they'll say that.
Wow.
And what was interesting is a completely different survey done by a completely different company found the same number, exactly the same, 70% of wives saying that they would prefer to have their husbands home more, even if it meant a smaller paycheck. So on both sides, we're getting people saying, we want more time with our family. And, if we could have more flexible hours and do some home-based work. By the way, 2/3 of women at home already do economically productive work. That was a bit of a surprise. Red Book magazine did a survey. 62%. So about 2/3 of mothers who are home are working part-time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's, we are in a sense reproducing the pre-industrial pattern.
We're trying to piece it back together as best we can. My husband's in an industry where he kind of has to be present. It's hospitality industry. It's kind of hard to cook and run a hotel and without being there. But I can tell you this, his industry is everyone in his industry, the way they move up that corporate ladder, the resume ladder, the job ladder, is they move. They move every year, 2, 3 years. You pick up a family, you uproot them, you move to a new place, new schools, new churches, new whatever, and plant yourself again. I mean, people do this over and over and over and over. We made a very deliberate choice early on in his career. We weren't going to do that. We planted ourselves in Nashville, Tennessee, and lived there for a dozen years. And then because my family was there, my parents were there. And then God opened a door for us to live near my husband's family here outside of Birmingham, Alabama. So that's where we've been the last 6 years. He could have been promoted many, many, many times over, but we valued what was best for the kids, what was best for the family over that upward mobility on the ladder. And he's also had to, just say no a lot of times. No, I can't, and really prioritize the family and corporate situation that doesn't always value that. But you're right. We need to be pushing for that in the job market where they're valuing families, because if they have families that have healthy family environments, they're going to be able to produce more. That's just the bottom line. And that's what the research is showing, according that you included in the book.
Yeah, and a lot of times people question, well, how many jobs can be done at home? Usually, not all jobs can be, of course, but often some aspect of the job can be. So we have a friend who's a car mechanic. He owns his own car garage. He runs it. He's the owner, operator. You can't fix cars at home if you have to have a lift and everything.
Yeah, that'd be a little awkward in the den, wouldn't it?
But he brings his bookworking home.
Yes.
Bookkeeping. He brings the bookkeeping home and he sits at the kitchen table while his kids are doing their homework. He's sitting there doing his bookkeeping while they're doing their homework. So he's there to answer the questions, to discuss the ideas that they're learning in school, and of course to counter any non-Christian ideas that are being taught in his school. They can have these really good discussions. And I thought, this is great that he's managed to find a way to bring, part of the work home, even if it's not the whole work. So it takes some creativity, I think, sometimes. But if we're motivated enough, there are a whole lot of things that could be done, at least part-time, from home.
And you're right. Even with my husband's job, there are aspects of it that he can do on the computer at home that can help him to be a better presence in the home. So I was just so blown away by it. I had never considered how that part of our history really transformed the home like no other part of history. So I found that to be fascinating. Another part of the book that I just was so awesome. You talked about how revolutionary really the Christian faith was for women early on, you talk about the general perception. I know, like right now in our culture, is that Christian marriage and Christian femininity is repressive or oppressive for women. But you completely set the record straight when you talked about what life was like for women in the New Testament world, and honestly, throughout much of human history, and how Christian marriage really transformed the home for the better. We don't really understand that history. Explain to us a little bit about that, because I found that to be so fascinating. And that is where we will pick up the conversation in the next episode, moms and dads. Christian marriage was nothing short of revolutionary for women, for children, for marriage, and for the family. And yet, Christianity gets such a bad rap in our culture when it comes to all of these things. It is considered repressive and oppressive. And all the while, Christianity has liberated women and children and marriage from the bondage it once was. We need to know this history, and so do our kids. We will set the record straight in the next episode as we continue our conversation with one of America's preeminent evangelical Protestant male or female intellectuals. You don't want to miss it. I want to thank you for joining me today. Look, I know there are a lot of things you could be listening to right now, and I really appreciate that you took this time to spend with me. I hope you will join me for my next podcast when we take aim at some aspect of our culture that threatens to derail our parenting and steal our kids' faith. If you enjoyed this episode of Christian Parent Crazy World, would you consider telling a friend and sharing it on social media and giving it a good review over on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and following me on Facebook and Instagram? And maybe you could say that Christian Parent Crazy World is the best podcast you've ever heard in your entire life. Just a thought. And be sure to check out my website, which is CatherineSegars.com. That's Catherine with a C. I have lots of articles and resources there that will help you on your parenting journey. And if you subscribe, I will be sure to send you some really cool free stuff and notify you of future podcasts, articles, and blogs. I want to end this and every episode with a word of encouragement. God gave you your kids, your specific kids, for a reason. That's because you hold the key to unlocking who God created them to be. We'll see you next time.
Christian Parent Crazy World is a production of Life Audio and Salem Media. If you liked what you heard today, please take a second to rate and review this podcast in your favorite podcast app so that more listeners like you can find the show. For more faith-filled, inspirational podcasts, visit us at lifeaudio.com.